The air above the valley was cool and thick with the aroma of spring. It carried the sweet, earthy scent of blooming wild thyme and the rich, pungent smell of recently turned soil. To Luca, the smell was a song, a quiet assurance that the world was still sane. He drove the plow with hands that knew every curve of the land, hands calloused and dark with the memory of generations of work. This was his heritage, a life tied to the rhythm of the seasons, to the hard-scrabble earth of central Italy. At 20 years old, his world was the farm, his family, and the stubborn, beautiful land that demanded their devotion. They lived under the Mezzadria system, sharing half their harvest with the landowner, a quiet agreement that had bound their lives for as long as anyone could remember. In the distance, the stone farmhouse stood as a sentinel against the blue-green hills, its tile roof a warm terracotta against the crisp sky. Inside, his mother would be kneading bread, the smell of fresh yeast a promise of supper. His grandfather, Nonno Ettore, sat on the stone wall, his face a roadmap of every hardship and every harvest, whittling a piece of oak into a spoon. He never spoke much, but his presence was as constant and reassuring as the sun. Nonno Ettore's quiet disdain for the fascist regime was not spoken, but shown in his refusal to engage with politics. To him, such things were the folly of city men, far removed from the honest toil of the land. For Luca, a life beyond this valley felt as alien as a foreign shore. The world outside was a jumble of garbled words from the old buzzing radio. The voice spoke of battles and lines, the Gustav Line, a defensive wall somewhere to the south. Luca could not connect these words to his own life. The war was a problem for other men, men who wore uniforms and knew how to hold a rifle, not men who knew how to plant a vineyard or coax a fig tree to fruit. Yet a low, constant rumble often vibrated through the air, not the sudden fury of a thunderstorm, but a persistent mechanical sound that made the old dogs unrestless. It was a sound that made Nonno Ettore pause his whittling, his eyes gazing south toward the horizon with a look of ancient, weary knowledge. The life of a peasant was one of quiet self-sufficiency. The family worked together, a single body with many limbs. Their culture and identity were rooted in this earth, in the simple shared tasks of planting and harvesting. This deep attachment to the land was both their greatest strength and their most profound vulnerability. It was a world insulated from the grand ideological battles that raged just beyond the hills, a world where the most important thing was not the defeat of an enemy, but the success of the next crop. A life defined by the cycle of life, not the machinery of death. The ideological demands of a government that cared nothing for the rhythm of the soil were a direct assault on this existence. Luca took a deep breath, the scent of the earth filling his lungs. He felt a profound sense of peace. The sun warmed his back, and the plow bit into the soil with a satisfying crunch. The land was not just a means of survival, it was a part of him, an extension of his own life. This connection, a bond that ran deeper than politics or nation, created a palpable sense of peace, one that would make the coming tragedy all the more stark. The war was coming not as a distant rumor, but as a storm that would tear his world apart. His story was not just about a soldier's journey, it was the story of a culture, a way of life, and an identity on the verge of being erased. The peasant's perspective, often overlooked in the grand narratives of military history, was the human core of this immense conflict. And in this quiet moment, with the scent of time on the wind, he was blissfully unaware that his life was about to become an example of that very truth.
The silence of the morning was shattered, not by a sound, but by its abrupt interruption.
A diesel engine sputtered to a halt down the road, followed by the clatter of heavy boots on the hard-packed earth. Luca's heart hammered against his ribs. The dogs, which had been basking lazily in the sun, began to bark, a frantic, desperate sound. 3 German soldiers rounded the bend, their uniforms a crisp, unwelcome gray against the soft green of the landscape. They carried rifles with a casual, efficient menace. One of them, an officer, barked commands in a harsh, guttural language. His voice was a stark, brutal contrast to the familiar sounds of the farm. Their presence was not a request, but a demand. Nonno Ettore rose slowly from the wall, his hands, so recently occupied with shaping wood, now hung loosely at his sides. He watched the soldiers with a grim, knowing expression. The officer's interpreter, a nervous-looking Italian with a pale face, stammered a translation. The men were needed for the Esercito Nazionale Repubblicano, the new puppet army allied with the Germans. The words felt like a foreign virus, infecting their quiet life. The armistice, a moment of fleeting hope months ago, had instead cleaved Italy in 2, forcing countrymen to choose between the king and the fascist republic. It was a civil war that had turned brother against brother, and now its tendrils reached even to this remote valley. To comply was to fight for a cause they despised. To refuse was to face immediate reprisal. As the officer pointed a gloved finger at Luca, a trusted elder from a nearby farm appeared, his face tight with urgency. He spoke in a low, quick dialect, urging Luca and 2 other young men to flee south, to the Allied lines where the king's new army, the Italian co-belligerent army, was forming. The choice was not a moral one, but a physical one, a desperate act of survival. They left under the cover of dusk, their footsteps silent on the damp earth. The scent of turned soil was replaced by the acrid smell of fear, the damp coolness of the night air now a sharp blade on their skin. The abstract concept of war had become visceral, tangible. On their second night, they skirted a small village and found a farmhouse, its roof collapsed, its walls scorched black. The air hung heavy with the smell of old smoke and the cloying scent of blood. This was not a statistic on the radio. It was a brutal reality etched in stone and wood. It was an arbitrary act of violence, a consequence of the fractured state where Germans saw every Italian civilian as a potential partisan. Luca's heart, which had been pounding from the physical exertion, now pounded with a cold, hollow dread. The journey was a navigation of a fractured national identity. They were not just escaping an enemy, but traversing a landscape where the very definition of us and them was fluid and dangerous. The older men whispered stories of how quickly the Germans had taken over after the armistice, seizing control and reinforcing their forces. The war was no longer a distant hum, but a present, suffocating fear. The realization that they were not just fleeing from Germans, but from a version of their own countrymen, those who had chosen the opposite path, was a chilling one. Every step south was a step into a world where allegiance was a matter of life and death, and where the arbitrary violence they had witnessed was a consequence of a nation at war with itself. The old world of soil and seasons had been replaced by a new one of danger and division. The air at the base of Monte Cassino tasted of dust and cold stone. It was a raw, bone-aching cold that seeped through Luca's thin coat and into his very marrow. The constant, low drone of distant artillery was the new silence. It was a mechanical, inhuman sound that vibrated in his teeth and rattled the very ground beneath his feet. The smell of damp mud, cordite, and unwashed bodies clung to everything. His clothes, stiff with dried mud, felt like a second skin. This was his new reality, a world of dirt and fear. They had been picked up by a unit of the Italian co-belligerent army, a group of men who, like him, had fled south to fight alongside the Allies. Their faces were a canvas of exhaustion and grim resolve. Their eyes held a shared understanding, a silent recognition of the life they had lost and the life they now endured. They dug their trenches in a zigzag pattern, a winding network of narrow, muddy corridors that offered a meager sanctuary from the endless enemy fire. Luca's hands, which had once felt the smooth, yielding surface of soil, now knew the rough, splintered feel of a shovel handle and the cold, metallic weight of his rifle. Life in the trenches was a slow, agonizing grind. The mud was a living, clinging entity that swallowed boots and stole warmth. The constant cold was a physical presence, a weight on his shoulders. The sounds of the battlefield were a symphony of terror, the ear-splitting shriek of an incoming shell, the distant crack of a rifle, the rhythmic, sinister chatter of a machine gun. It was a cacophony that never ceased, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. Sleep was a series of brief, muddy hallucinations. Luca would wake with a start, the ghost of a mother's hug or the taste of her bread on his tongue, only to be jolted back to the reality of the cold, the mud, and the distant roar. One night, on a stealthy patrol behind enemy lines, the constant noise ceased, replaced by a profound and unsettling stillness. They moved through the darkness, their boots making no sound on the wet grass. The air for a moment held only the scent of wet stone. In the silence, Luca's ears strained to pick up the faintest sound of movement. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, a frantic, desperate drumbeat. As they crept past a German defensive position, Luca noticed a small, hand-carved piece of wood lying in the mud, a crude carving of a rooster. It was a simple, universal object, a piece of trench art. It was a jarring reminder of the humanity of the men on the other side. They, too, had once known the peace of a life beyond this apocalyptic landscape, a life of simple joys and quiet work. The battlefield, with its destroyed landscape and the shattered Abbey of Monte Cassino looming over them, was a force that actively worked to degrade and erase humanity. Luca's transformation was not only a result of the combat, but also of the constant, soul-crushing environment that threatened to strip him of his very self. That small, crude carving became a symbol of the fight to retain humanity in a place designed to destroy it. It was a fleeting, yet profound moment of stillness amidst the chaos, a brief flash of shared existence that transcended the brutal realities of war. The cold was a constant ache, but now it was joined by a more profound pain. The battle for the Gustav Line had become a grinding, brutal siege, and with it came the bitter realization that Luca was not just fighting a foreign army, but an internal one. His fellow soldiers shared stories in low, hushed tones, stories of the Italian social republic, the puppet state to the north. They spoke of a nation torn in two, of an armistice that had led not to peace, but to a deeply personal, tragic civil war. The enemy was not just the faceless German soldier, but a brother, a cousin, a fellow Italian. The propaganda from the RSI painted a heroic picture of their cause, but Luca had heard the whispered stories of violence and betrayal. During a reconnaissance mission near a small, isolated garrison, Luca's unit stumbled upon the enemy. There was no grand charge, no sudden hail of bullets. The moment was silent and fraught with tension. The soldiers were not Germans, but Italians in mismatched uniforms, their faces haggard and young. They had chosen the other side. A brief, tragic confrontation ensued, a quiet, deeply personal standoff between men who might have grown up in neighboring villages. The sound of their own language, used to give commands, was a cruel, haunting reality. The moment was not about military tactics, but about moral injury. It was the realization that the people you were fighting might be your own, a truth more devastating than any shell. As they moved through the ravaged landscape, Luca saw the signs of brutal German and RSI reprisals against civilians. A farmhouse, its windows shattered and its door hanging open, was a monument to vengeance. The sight cemented the terror his family must have faced. He also overheard a grim, whispered story from an older soldier, a tale of an Italian soldier who, in a moment of despair or rage, had committed a heinous crime against a civilian. This was not a story of heroic fight, but a grim account of how war could corrupt the soul. The line between hero and villain had blurred beyond recognition, and even those on his side were capable of monstrous acts. The constant fear, the cold, and the moral ambiguity began to weigh on Luca's spirit. He had lost his innocence and was haunted by the images of destruction and the faces of those he had seen. He had a constant metallic taste in his mouth, a flavor he associated with blood and despair. He felt the cold not just on his skin, but in his bones, a chilling awareness of the world's brutality. The constant pounding heart in his chest was a drum of anxiety, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. The constant tension of being in a war where the enemy could be anyone, and the realization that the people you were fighting might be your own, created a profound and lasting psychological toll. The war in Italy was not just a front in a global conflict, but a deeply personal, tragic civil war, where propaganda and brutal reality clashed. The narrative had to move beyond a simple military account and explore this moral complexity. Luca's personal confrontation with the enemy was a microcosm of the larger national tragedy. This was not a story of triumph, but of a young man's painful realization that a fight for freedom also meant fighting the very people you were trying to liberate. The final push was a slow, methodical crawl up the mountain, a weary advance that was more a testament to exhaustion than to brute force. Finally, after months of grinding combat, the Germans began their retreat from Monte Cassino, leaving behind a land of absolute destruction. Luca's unit, a shadow of its former self, entered the shattered city of Cassino. The silence that followed the battle was not peaceful, it was deafening, a profound absence of the constant roar of artillery. He climbed the hill and stood before the ruins of the abbey, a once majestic structure reduced to a pile of shattered stone and twisted rebar. It was the final, visual testament to the sheer destructive force of the conflict. Luca began the long walk home, a journey that was as much a spiritual pilgrimage as a physical one. The road was scarred, but not dead. He saw families returning to their homes, their faces etched with grief, but their eyes focused on the future. He encountered displaced families and disillusioned soldiers, all of them a part of the long, painful process of reconstruction. He felt the weight of his experience, the phantom ache of the cold, the ghostly echo of the gunshots. But with each step, he also felt a burgeoning sense of hope. The war was over for him, but the work of healing was just beginning. He saw his family's farm from a distance, its tile roof a familiar splash of terracotta against the green hills. It was damaged, but the main house still stood, a stubborn monument to their resilience. The reunion was not one of grand speeches or soaring emotions, but a quiet,
tearful embrace. He felt the familiar, comforting weight of his mother's frail, warm hands on his face. She smelled of herbs and smoke. The first mouthful of her simple, home-cooked food was a flavor he had thought he would never taste again, a simple, delicious reminder of a world that still existed. The deep, familiar scent of the family home, a mix of old plaster and fresh bread, was a profound assurance that he had not been lost forever. The final scene was one of quiet reflection. Luca stood in his field, a landscape of shell craters and overturned soil. The war had not just scorched the surface, it had dug deep, leaving scars that might never fully heal. He reached down and took a handful of the dirt. He felt its texture, coarse and granular, mixed with bits of metal shrapnel. He smelled its scent, the same as before, but changed, bearing the memory of the violence that had taken place. The act of returning was the true climax of his story. His victory was not military, but personal. The decision to survive, to return, and to begin the long, slow work of rebuilding. The physical act of repairing the farmhouse and working the land was a stand-in for the emotional work required to heal from trauma. The story concludes with a note of cautious optimism. The war had ended, but the profound human journey was just beginning. The earth, which had seen and absorbed so much, would remember the pain. But in its patient, quiet healing, it offered humanity a chance to heal as well.